The following script is designed for a deep dive, high-energy political commentary video. It focuses on the clash between Ben Shapiro and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, framing it as a pivotal moment for the defense of free market capitalism against the rising tide of radical socialism. Welcome to the front lines of the battle for the American soul, where the smoke is finally clearing from what can only be described as a total intellectual demolition on Capitol Hill. For years, we have been told by the mainstream media that the future of this country belongs to a new wave of radical influencers turned politicians who prioritize feelings over facts and hashtags over history. They have paraded through the halls of power with an air of untouchable moral superiority, while attempting to dismantle the very economic engines that made this nation the greatest force for prosperity in human history. But today, the narrative hit a brick wall in the form of cold hard logic, and the kind of surgical scrutiny that the woke left simply cannot survive when the cameras are rolling and the teleprompters are gone. What we witnessed during this hearing was not just a debate between two public figures, but a fundamental collision between two entirely different worldviews that are currently fighting for the steering wheel of the United States. On one side, you have the personification of the modern socialist movement, a woman who has built a career on the optics of victimhood and the promise of free everything at the expense of everyone else. On the other side, you have the relentless application of conservative principles and a refusal to let emotional theatrics override the basic laws of economics that govern our reality. It was a moment of clarity for every American who has been gaslit into believing that profit is a dirty word and that the government is the only legitimate source of morality. The centerpiece of this confrontation was the absolute disaster surrounding the Amazon headquarters deal in New York City, a case study in how radical ideology can destroy thousands of jobs and billions in tax revenue in a single heartbeat. When Ben Shapiro stepped to the microphone, he didn't just bring opinions, he brought the receipts that the media has been trying to bury for months. He laid out the timeline of how a massive opportunity for economic growth was strangled in the crib by a representative who didn't understand the difference between a tax incentive and a cash handout. It was a masterclass in exposing the fact that the loudest voices in the room are often the ones with the least understanding of how a paycheck is actually created in the real world. As the hearing progressed, you could see the visible discomfort on the face of the Congresswoman as her carefully curated social media persona began to crumble under the weight of actual cross-examination. It is one thing to shout slogans at a rally or post a viral tweet to millions of followers who never challenge your assumptions, but it is another thing entirely to sit across from a man who treats every sentence like a logical equation. Shapiro began peeling back the layers of the socialist onion, revealing that underneath the talk of the working class and the struggle of the common man lies a foundation of deep-seated hypocrisy and a personal lifestyle that contradicts every word of her public rhetoric. The folder Shapiro produced during the session was the smoking gun that the American people needed to see because it bridged the gap between policy and personality. It is easy to preach the virtues of wealth redistribution when you are the one deciding who gets what, but it becomes a lot harder to justify when your own spending habits reflect the very elite class you claim to despise. We saw the details of luxury designer clothing and high-end lifestyle choices that exist in a completely different universe from the constituents who were promised that their lives would improve if only they would hand over more power to the state. This wasn't just a personal attack, it was a necessary exposure of the rules for thee but not for me mentality that defines the modern left. This is the fundamental flaw of the socialist dream. It always ends with the elite living like kings while the people they represent are left to fight over the scraps of a dying economy. We have seen this movie before in every country that has dared to trade its freedom for the false promise of government-guaranteed equity. The tragedy of the Amazon deal wasn't just a lost building or a missed logo in the skyline, it was the loss of 25,000 livelihoods for people who just wanted to work and provide for their families. Shapiro didn't let that point slide. He brought the focus back to the human cost of radicalism by highlighting the people who were actually hurt by this performative political stunt. The testimony from the local constituent was perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment of the entire day because it stripped away the academic jargon and the political posturing. Here was a real American telling the stories of neighbors and friends who had their hopes for a better future vaporized because a politician wanted to win points on Twitter. This is the reality that the radical left refuses to acknowledge because they view people as statistics and voting blocks rather than individuals with dreams and agency. When you look at the silence coming from the other side of the aisle during that testimony, You saw the true face of the movement, a movement that is more interested in the destruction of successful corporations than the elevation of the individual worker. The logic applied by Shapiro was a reminder that you cannot help the wage earner by pulling down the wage pair, and you cannot build a prosperous society by punishing the very success that fuels it. Every time the Congresswoman tried to pivot back to her talking points, she was met with a factual correction that served as a reminder of why we have these debates in the first place. The total collapse of her political image in that room was a victory for every person who still believes that common sense should prevail over ideological madness. It was a sign that the American people are waking up to the fact that you can't pay your rent with virtue signaling, and you can't grow an economy on a foundation of resentment. As we look toward the future, the lessons of this hearing must not be forgotten, because the forces that want to transform this country into a centralized socialist state are not going away. They are well funded, they are supported by a compliant media, and they are deeply embedded in our educational institutions. However, what we saw today proves that they are intellectually bankrupt when forced to defend their positions in an open forum. Logic is a powerful weapon, and when it is wielded by someone who understands the stakes of this battle, it is capable of cutting through years of propaganda in a matter of minutes. This was a win for the truth, a win for the taxpayer, and a win for the enduring power of the American dream. Moving deeper into the heart of this confrontation, we have to talk about the fundamental misunderstanding of capital that the radical left uses to manipulate the masses. When the Congresswoman stood up to rail against the tax incentives offered to Amazon, she portrayed it as if the city of New York was literally writing a check for $3 billion and handing it over to Jeff Bezos. This is the ultimate socialist lie. It is a mathematical hallucination. In reality, that money didn't exist yet. It was a discount on future taxes that would only be paid if the company moved in and created the wealth in the first place. By killing the deal, she didn't save $3 billion to spend on schools or subways. She simply ensured that New York would get 0% of something instead of a massive percentage of $27 billion in new revenue. This is where Shapiro's expertise in economic reality becomes a lethal weapon against the woke economic theory. He forced the room to confront the basic reality that you cannot redistribute what has not been produced. While the Congresswoman was busy celebrating on social media, claiming that she had saved the city from corporate greed, the actual data showed a much darker picture. Small businesses in Queens, the delis, the construction firms, the local service providers, saw their future orders vanish overnight. Shapiro didn't just call this a mistake, he called it a dereliction of duty. He framed it as a betrayal of the very working-class people she claims to represent, proving that for the radical left, the ideology of taxing the rich is more important than the reality of employing the poor. The hypocrisy reached a fever pitch when the discussion shifted from the macroeconomy to the micro-level of personal conduct. It is a classic hallmark of socialist leaders throughout history. They demand austerity and sacrifice from the public while living in a world of privilege that they claim to despise. Shapiro highlighted the specific instance of the Congresswoman's attendance at high society events, where the price of a single ticket exceeds the annual income of many families in her district. When you are wearing a gown that says "tax the rich" while sipping champagne with the very billionaires you are supposedly fighting, you aren't a revolutionary. You are a brand. You are a walking advertisement for a lifestyle that is funded by the very system you are trying to burn down. This brings us to the core of the common sense defense that Shapiro championed throughout the hearing. The American people have a very high tolerance for success, but they have a very low tolerance for being looked down upon by people who think they are better than the rest of us. The reason this footage has gone viral isn't just because of the sharp one-liners. It's because it resonates with the millions of Americans who go to work every day, pay their taxes, and follow the rules, only to see politicians exempt themselves from the consequences of their own policies. Shapiro pointed out that while the Congresswoman pushes for green mandates that would make air travel and car ownership prohibitively expensive for the average family, she is frequently seen utilizing the very conveniences she seeks to ban for others. The debate over the Amazon deal was also a debate over the sovereignty of the individual versus the power of the state. The left wants a world where every economic decision is filtered through a committee of bureaucrats who decide which companies are moral enough to exist. Shapiro's counterargument was a soaring defense of the free market as the most democratic system ever devised. In a free market, the consumer is the boss. In a socialist system, The politician is the boss. By driving Amazon out of New York, the Congresswoman wasn't standing up for the people. She was standing up for her own power to dictate terms to a private entity, regardless of the cost to her constituents' livelihoods. During the most intense exchange of the hour, we saw the Congresswoman struggle to define basic economic terms that should be prerequisite for anyone sitting on a financial services committee. When Shapiro pressed her on the definition of capital and the role of risk in investment, the silence was deafening. It exposed a terrifying truth. The people who want to radically transform the most complex economy in the world often don't understand the most basic principles of how it functions. It's like having a surgeon who doesn't believe in germ theory or a pilot who thinks gravity is a social construct. This isn't just a difference of opinion. It is a dangerous level of incompetence shielded by a layer of moral arrogance. We also have to address the squeaky wheel tactic that the left uses to dominate the conversation. They rely on the idea that if they shout loud enough and label their opponents with enough derogatory terms, they can win by default. But Shapiro demonstrated that when you stand your ground and refuse to accept their premises, the entire house of cards falls apart. He didn't apologize for being successful, he didn't apologize for defending the Constitution, and he didn't apologize for believing that math is real. That refusal to back down is what the conservative movement has been missing for years, and it is exactly what is needed to turn the tide against this radical encroachment on our freedoms. As we analyze the fallout of this hearing, it becomes clear that the AOC brand has taken a massive hit among anyone who values substance over style. The patriot response to this is simple. We must continue to demand that our leaders be held to a standard of reality. We cannot allow the country to be run by vibes and viral moments while our competitors on the global stage are focused on production and strength. Shapiro's closing remarks served as a rallying cry for a return to the Lathwong, common sense, that built this nation. A belief that hard work should be rewarded, that contracts should be honored, and that the government should stay out of the way of the American people's ingenuity. The demolition continued as Shapiro moved the scalpel toward the cultural narrative that the radical left uses to insulate themselves from criticism. One of the most insidious tactics we see today is the weaponization of identity to deflect from failed policy. When you challenge the economics of a socialist plan, they don't respond with better numbers. They respond by calling you a bigot, a sexist, or a relic of the past. But in this hearing, that shield was shattered. Shapiro ignored the bait and kept the focus on the actual destruction of the American middle class. He pointed out that the woke agenda isn't just a social movement. It is an economic parasite that drains the resources of the productive to fund the lifestyles of the professional activist class. The Congresswoman's struggle to answer for the loss of tax revenue wasn't just a personal failure. It was a failure of the entire ideology. If you believe that the government is the source of all prosperity, then you naturally believe that you can simply order an economy to work. You think you can ban gas-powered cars, mandate a $30 minimum wage, and tax unrealized gains without any consequences. Shapiro brought up the historical precedent of rent control in cities like New York and San Francisco, showing how these compassionate policies actually lead to housing shortages and urban decay. He framed the Amazon debacle as rent control for the soul, a way for politicians to feel good about themselves while their neighbors lose their homes. One of the most powerful moments was when Shapiro addressed the sovereignty of the taxpayer. He reminded the room that every dollar the government spends is a dollar that was first earned by an American citizen through sweat and labor. When the left speaks about the government's money, they are engaging in a form of linguistic theft. It is your money. It is the money for your children's college fund, your retirement, and your small business expansion. By treating the Amazon incentive as a lost gift, the Congresswoman revealed that she views all private property as ultimately belonging to the state. This is the hallmark of the deep dive into socialist theory that we must expose. They don't want to help you earn more. They want to make sure you can't survive without them. The discussion then shifted to the common sense reality of border security and its impact on the economy, an area where the Congresswoman has been notoriously radical. Shapiro linked the two issues by explaining that you cannot have a generous welfare state and open borders at the same time. It is a mathematical impossibility. By pushing for both, the radical left is intentionally trying to bankrupt the system to force a total state takeover. This isn't a conspiracy. It is an observation of their own stated goals. The hearing exposed that the Green New Deal and Medicare for all are not just policies. They are hammers intended to break the back of the American taxpayer so that a new, more authoritarian system can be built in the rubble. As the testimony of the forgotten constituents continued, the air in the room changed. These were the patriots who had been silenced by the media, the construction workers who lost the Amazon contracts, and the small business owners who saw their property values plummet. Shapiro stood as their advocate, using his platform to amplify the voices that the woke elite try to drown out with noise. He showed that the real war on the poor isn't being waged by corporations, but by the very bureaucrats who claim to be their protectors. Every regulation, every block deal, and every tax hike is a new chain on the legs of the American worker. The visual of the congresswoman scrolling through her phone while a man talked about losing his livelihood was the ultimate mask-off moment. It proved that for the radical left, the suffering of individuals is a small price to pay for the progress of the collective. Shapiro didn't let her off the hook, calling out the disrespect and the lack of basic empathy for the people her policies had crushed. He reminded the audience that socialism is the doctrine of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. The envy was on full display, an envy of success, an envy of excellence, and an envy of anyone who dares to be self-sufficient. In the final stretch of this intellectual combat, we saw the restoration of the patriot ideal. Shapiro concluded by articulating that America is not a system of oppression, as the congresswoman frequently claims, but a system of opportunity. He pointed out that the very fact she, a former bartender, could rise to the highest levels of government is proof that the American system works. Yet, she spent her time in office trying to pull up the ladder behind her so that no one else could achieve the American dream through the same free market mechanisms that created the wealth she now enjoys. This hearing will go down in history as the moment the woke bubble finally burst. It wasn't because of a better slogan or a louder shout. It was because the common sense of the American people found a voice that wouldn't be silenced. We saw the triumph of the individual over the collective, the triumph of the facts over the feelings, and the triumph of the truth over the lie. As we move forward, we must use this victory as a blueprint. We must never stop asking the hard questions. We must never stop following the money, and we must never stop defending the freedom that makes everything else possible. The systematic dismantling of the socialist facade didn't just stop at economic theory. It moved into the territory of moral accountability. As we watched the footage of Shapiro leaning in, it wasn't just about the numbers anymore. It was about the fundamental dishonesty that fuels the modern progressive movement. He challenged the idea that the congresswoman and her allies are the moral arbiters of our society. For too long, the right has played defense, allowing the left to frame every debate as the heartless capitalists versus the compassionate activists. Shapiro flipped the script entirely, proving that there is nothing compassionate about a policy that traps people in cycles of government dependency while their leaders thrive in ivory towers funded by the very taxpayers they criticize. The freedom to fail is just as important as the freedom to succeed, and Shapiro's analysis of the Amazon deal highlighted a terrifying new trend: the government picking winners and losers based on political purity tests. He argued that when a politician can unilaterally destroy a multi-billion-dollar investment because it doesn't align with their woke sensibilities, we no longer live in a free market republic. We are entering the territory of a planned economy, where your ability to do business depends on your willingness to bend the knee to the prevailing ideology of the day. This is the sovereignty of the individual being traded for the sovereignty of the bureaucrat, and it is a path that leads directly to the stagnation we see in the failing cities of Europe and South America. Shapiro then turned his attention to the deep state of the media, which acted as a protective barrier for the congresswoman for years. He exposed how the mainstream press ignored her blatant factual errors while hyper-focusing on the optics of her being a young, charismatic leader. This hearing was the first time that the common sense of the American public was allowed to penetrate that media bubble. When the congresswoman attempted to use her standard talking points about fair shares, Shapiro was ready with a breakdown of IRS data showing that the top 1% of earners already pay nearly 40% of all federal income taxes. The myth of the untaxed rich was dismantled in real time, leaving the socialist narrative with nowhere to hide. The hypocrisy of the Green New Deal advocates was also put under the microscope during the final hours of the session. Shapiro questioned how someone can advocate for the total elimination of fossil fuels, a move that would double or triple the energy costs for every working-class family, while they themselves utilize private transportation and live in high-energy consumption luxury. This isn't just a minor oversight. It is the core of the Socialist project. It is a system designed to create a two-tiered society, a small class of enlightened planners who enjoy the fruits of modern technology, and a massive underclass of citizens who are told that their carbon footprint is the reason the world is ending. As the hearing reached its climax, we saw the emotional toll that this ideology takes on the patriots who actually build this country. Shapiro invited the cameras to look at the faces of the union workers who had been promised jobs that never materialized. He made it clear that these people were not just collateral damage in a political war. They were the primary victims of a radical ideology that views the working man as a tool to be used and then discarded. The contrast was stark. On one side, you had a politician focused on her national brand and her next gala appearance. On the other side, you had a commentator standing up for the plumber, the electrician, and the small business owner who just wanted the government to get out of their way. The closing arguments of this 60-minute intellectual battle served as a manifesto for the future of the conservative movement. Shapiro didn't just win a debate, he provided a roadmap for how to fight back against the woke encroachment on our lives. He reminded us that the American dream is not a gift from a government. It is a right endowed by our Creator and protected by our Constitution. He urged the audience to reject the politics of envy and to embrace the politics of excellence. The message was loud and clear. If you want a country that works, you have to support the people who work. You have to defend the market, you have to defend the family, and you have to defend the truth. This was a total vindication of free market principles over the failed promises of the collective. The common sense victory achieved in that hearing room has sent shockwaves through the political establishment, proving that the radical left is a paper tiger when faced with courage and clarity. We have seen the blueprint for the next decade of American politics. It is a battle between those who believe in the power of the individual and those who believe in the power of the state. And if today was any indication, the patriots are just getting started. The truth is out, the receipts have been shown, and the era of unchallenged socialist rhetoric is officially over.